History here is colonial history. First Spain, then America. The joke goes 3 centuries in a Spanish convent and 50 years in Hollywood. Colonial rule did not improve conditions in the countryside, nor did independence granted in 1946 by the United States. Widespread poverty has spawned unrest and rebellion. Communist insurgents operate throughout the country. President Ferdinand Marcos promised reforms and prosperity, but he and his wife Imelda plundered the country, driving it into bankruptcy. Opposition to them mounted, especially in Manila. In August 1983, Benigno Aquino, his nickname was Ninoy, Marcos's chief political rival, returned home from 3 years of exile in America, hoping to lead the opposition. He was assassinated at the airport. His death shocked the world, and it marked a turning point, both in Washington and Manila. Congressman Stephen Solars of New York and his wife Nina paid their respects.
Ninoy's murder had almost as dramatic an impact on Washington as it did in the Philippines. I would say that before Ninoy was killed, there was a kind of hear no evil, see no evil, and speak no evil attitude on the part of the administration. Whereas after Ninoy's assassination, the administration was prepared to recognize that something was rotten in the state of Denmark.
And the thing that impressed me then was the large numbers of people, just ordinary Filipino citizens, people who didn't even know Ninoy, all of a sudden showed up at his house to view the body. And this went on for 2 or 3 days. He had huge crowds outside of his house, lines just stretching down the block. Talking about maybe 100,000 or several 100,000 people passing through the house day and night during those 2 or 3 days. I was amazed because I didn't know, and Ninoy didn't know, what kind of a reception he would receive when he went home. He'd been in jail for 7 years and 7 months. He had been in the United States for 3 years. With the Marcos-controlled press, there was not much about Ninoy in the press. So he didn't know whether people there had forgotten him.
But Filipinos had not forgotten him. More than 1 million people turned out for his funeral. It was a massive protest against Marcos in an atmosphere of celebration.
His death, let it not be a joke. It's becoming a fiesta of jokes now. And it's not fair to the man. And it's not fair to a Filipino. And for us, the dead is sacred.
And this is a tragedy to us. Because even in the worst possible days, this has never happened. We've always maintained a sense of decency.
The United States had backed Marcos despite his misrule. But now senior American officials began to worry that his regime was crumbling.
And the president was concerned about it. He knew Marcos, had known Marcos a long time. And we wanted to see Marcos be a hero. The only way you could be a hero is to do a good job and get things straightened around.
You had lots of middle-class types, housewives, business executives, who had simply never done this sort of thing before, literally flooding out into the streets and venting their anger and protest. Whenever demonstrations had occurred in the past, it had been led by students or leftists or union members demonstrating for something or other. But you had never had a demonstration by executives and business people and white-collar workers. And this was truly unprecedented.
As Marcos's grip weakened, the communist insurgency spread through the countryside. To assure loyalty to himself, Marcos had promoted corrupt, incompetent officers. His troops were badly led, badly paid, badly equipped. Navy Captain Rex Robles, a career officer, recalled their frustrations.
The main problems with the armed forces was that the soldiers were getting clobbered. They suffered a lot of casualties, so they were not fighting very well. They'd go out on patrol. There would be no medics coming along, and even if there would be medics, they wouldn't be sure of air evacuation, for instance, if there is an encounter and somebody gets hurt. And when they get back to the hospital, it's problematic if there would be doctors or nurses.
Troops recover their dead from a rebel ambush. As casualties mounted, young officers became increasingly frustrated. They organized a reform movement to exert pressure on Marcos to improve the Army's fighting ability.
But at the same time, their behavior was under question because there were so many abuses. The effect on the population was to alienate them from the soldiers. In many barrios or barangays, when the soldiers come in, the people would start to close their windows, close shop, and the children would run away. But every time we bring up these problems, and even officially at times, we would all be brushed aside, and people would say, there's nothing wrong with the armed forces. Everything is under control, everything is all right, And it burned people up inside. And I think if you can talk of one single factor which made the reform movement grow quickly and made it strong in spirit, if not in actual numbers, it was this sense of outrage at the blatant indifference of the people above us, to include the president. So we said, if this trend continues, then we might have to consider actions that would threaten Malacanang's existence directly. You are a reform movement. You're trying to improve the armed forces. You're trying to improve the country. So why not just move against Marcos right away? Because that's the thing to do. This is a message that we got from many, many sectors, to include businessmen, teachers, students even, laborers.
By 1984, the protests against Marcos were intensifying. Some top U.S. officials were now concerned that America's bases might be jeopardized. One of the first to recommend that America drop Marcos was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral William Crowell.
I drew the conclusion that if we were to preserve our relationship, a very profitable mutual relationship with the Philippines, that things were going to have to change. He was not going to make those changes, and that as long as he was there, it was going to go downhill and eventually destroy it. And then he better start worrying about competence in the field instead of on the dance floor in Manila.
But the Marcoses continued to throw lavish parties as if nothing were happening. They filmed this birthday party for one of their daughters.
When you start pondering the situation, you immediately came to the conclusion that for all concerned, it was best that Mr. Marcos left. Incidentally, when I was recommending all these things, I was very uneasy. It's not an easy, a comfortable thing to recommend to your own government that a head of state should be deposed or encouraged to step down. That's a momentous step.
By now, the communists had about 10,000 armed guerrillas and perhaps 500,000 supporters throughout the country. An organizer generates support for the movement among villagers on the island of Negros with revolutionary words to an old tune. The communists control large areas neglected by the government. In June 1984, a secret study by the U.S. Embassy in Manila blamed Marcos for the situation. It warned that unless he reformed his regime, communist influence would continue to spread. In a rebel zone, a bride and groom take their vows on a .45 caliber pistol.
The insurgency was growing, the military was disintegrating, the public protests were growing, the economy was in chaos. And I think that Marcos, for a long time, believed that while I was telling him certain things on direction of the State Department and even the White House, that in extremis, he would go to his friend Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan would be there for him. And we were looking for a way that we could communicate with Marcos so that he was left with no illusion that the message he was hearing was coming directly from his old friend Ronald Reagan.
And so we said, we better find somebody who Marcos knows is very close to the president, a pal, a real friend.
I'm sorry, I can't comment.
They enlisted Senator Paul Laxalt of Nevada, one of President Reagan's close friends.
For me to comment further.
He met with Marcos in October 1985.
Laxalt described very well, in some detail, the mounting concern in Washington over what was seen to be a deteriorating situation in the Philippines. And Marcos, who I could see was feeling pressed. I mean, I'd never seen him quite this tense before. And I think he simply concluded, all right, damn it, I'm going to outflank these guys strategically. I'm going to have an election, I'll win, and then I'll just tell the United States to go stuff it.
I'm afraid,
Marcos announced the election on American television.
Marcos, there's a perception here that your problems derive from the fact that your mandate is gone, whatever it once was. Now, there is a way of renewing a mandate, and that is to have elections.
I am ready to call a snap election, perhaps earlier than 8 months, perhaps in 3 months or less than that. If all these childish claims to popularity on both sides have to be settled, I think we better settle it by calling an election.
Marcos was sick and had to be carried into the campaign rallies. For him, the election was mainly an exercise in public relations. He hoped to show America that he was loyal to the democratic process, that he was not a dictator.
There was this growing need for a leader who could unite the opposition. And only she could do that. Because without her, everybody would be scrambling for position. And there would have been 3 or 4 or 5 presidential aspirants.
I just didn't want to be, a politician. I didn't want to be a candidate. And I've always been a very private person, and I felt that I had already done my share as far as the restoration of democracy was concerned. I mean, I felt I was not meant to be, at center stage. So it was a very sad decision for me. In fact, I was in tears when I was telling my children that I had to be the candidate.
But Cory proved to be a dynamic campaigner. Despite her lack of political experience, she exuded piety, simplicity, honesty, everything the Marcoses were not. Imelda Marcos campaigned for her husband. They had money and a strong political machine to dazzle the crowds. But they were opposed by the Catholic Church. The Archbishop of Manila, Cardinal Sin, rejected their appeals for endorsement.
Then Imelda was always here every night to change my mind in order that I would not go against them during the snap election. I said to her, you better go to the convents and talk to the sister to help you so that they can pray for you. But you cannot change my mind. They said that we should not get involved in politics. I think that is true. But politics is a human activity. And as a human activity, it has its moral aspect. Is it bad for me to go to the pulpit on Sunday and during the period of election, I would tell my people, make the election clean, honest, and fair? Who would say those things except the priest? Do not allow yourselves to be corrupted by money or other immoral considerations into voting for a candidate. Money offered to you in no way obliges you to vote for a particular candidate. Always vote according to your conscience.
I thought that any sort of straight, fair election Marcos would lose. I didn't expect that he would not cheat. I expected that quite likely he would have to cheat so much that the plausibility of the victory would be called very much into question, not just in the Philippines, but internationally, particularly with regard to the United States. I mean, you know, in a very major way, Marcos had held this election for the benefit of the United States, not for the benefit of the Philippines.
Now that we have the opportunity, now we must reassert the strength of our belief in freedom and in democracy.
Marcos and Imelda tried the showbiz techniques that had been effective in the past. But the old routines had lost their punch. The weight of America, which had backed them for so long, was also pressing against them.
We said, well, if there's going to be an election, it ought to be an honest-to-God election and be done properly. And that was a view all through our country and in the Congress, both sides of the aisle. And so in the end, that election was heavily observed by us.
Senator Richard Lugar of Indiana brought in a group of 20 prominent Americans. They flew around the country in American helicopters.
They got around, they observed what was going on, and of course, as practicing politicians, they know about how you get votes and count them and so on. That's their lifeblood.
The people were crowded around us. They wanted to shake our hands, have pictures taken. They wanted to tell us about their experiences. There was an identification with the United States of America that was very intense. We saw people who were alternately excessively hopeful that all would turn out all right, and excessively pessimistic, that simply you just couldn't win in this particular system. The counting that I watched, ballot by ballot, was absolutely correct. And people checked and rechecked it. Everyone stood all around and watched it. Much more open process than I would see even in my home state. I was struck, quite frankly, with the fact that the Filipinos love democracy, they love politics, they love voting, they loved every element of it. But I think that the dilemma came in those things that could not be seen and could not be observed.
In Manila, the results were coming in from all over the country. Suddenly, 30 computer technicians walked out, protesting that Marcos's people were rigging the count. Fearing retaliation by Marcos' security men, they took refuge in a nearby church.
They were to punch in from all over the country, these figures. Now, they punched, but they punched inverted figures. If it said Marcos 100, Aquino 50, they put it the other way around. So it was high tech, but the orders were to do something else. Then when these young people fled out on Sunday night and admitted what they were doing and sought refuge, well, of course, sort of the smoking gun of that entire proposition came to the fore.
As I said before, I'm not going to comment on...
At a Washington news conference, President Reagan minimized Marcos's cheating.
We're concerned about the violence that was evident there and the possibility of fraud, although it could have been that all of that was occurring on both sides.
The statement that the president made right after the election about there having been fraud on both sides, quite frankly, produced what was probably the single worst day of my life, because I had to then try to deal with the consequences of that in Manila, where it came like a giant tub of cold water.
Oh, this just absolutely was, for me, the end, you know, and I didn't even want to see the American ambassador when he wanted to call on me. And I said, what for? You know, if I am also being accused of cheating.
What the opposition thought they were hearing was confirmation of their worst suspicions, that in the end, despite all of our rhetoric about support for democratic processes and free elections, that in the end, we would go home with the guy that we came with, and that was Ferdinand Marcos.
President Reagan's remark encouraged Marcos to declare victory.
Tonight, we celebrate a historic victory. It is a victory won not by the candidates, but a victory won by those whose faith and loyalty to democracy and to freedom is unstinting, unlimited, and certainly a model for all generations to come.
Wherever I would go, people would shout and say, Cory, tell us what we have to do. So this influenced me greatly, because I said, apparently people are not going to accept, you know, the Marcos manipulated returns, and that we have to do something else. It was impressed upon me that we should hold more rallies and perhaps go into a nonviolent protest movement. And when I was asked, where do you think we should hold the rally? I said, well, the biggest place is Luneta, let's hold it there. And if people don't come, then that's a signal to us, okay, the people have accepted what Marcos has told them, and perhaps I can just go back to my private life. But wonder of wonders, I mean, I consider it really a miracle that here I am, the losing candidate, calling for a rally, and we get the biggest crowd of our lives.
We have come here to proclaim the determination of the Filipino people to continue the struggle against the forces of evil incarnated in those who have conspired to rob the people of their freedom.
At dawn on February 22, 1986, the Army Reform Movement began a coup against Marcos by seizing 2 Manila Army camps. Speaking over the Catholic radio station, Cardinal Sin called on the population to support the mutiny.
My dear people, this is a very critical time for our country. You spoke as a people in the last election, expressing your preference for peaceful change. I ask you now to be calm and to be prepared to express again your power as a people.
One of the dissident leaders was General Fidel Ramos, the Army Chief of Staff, a West Point graduate. The other, Juan Ponce Enrile, was Marcos's defense minister. Responding to Cardinal Sin's appeal, thousands poured into the streets to support the uprising.
We have committed this fatal act in order to bring to the world and to our Filipino people that the sad situation in the country is now coming to pass, and the day of reckoning is approaching.
There was already a commitment to really do something about the situation in the country then, with or without Mrs. Aquino. Mrs. Aquino, as far as we were concerned, was simply a historical accident.
But Cory had crystallized the opposition to Marcos.
I called up Mr. Juan Ponce Enrile and said, let's stop this fooling around. This is stupid business. I said, I can blast you out of there anytime.
Marcos sent in tanks, but the demonstrators blocked their advance. Marcos hesitated. He feared that bloodshed would hurt his image in the United States. At a palace news conference, his top general argued with him.
I understand you gave them orders to wait.
I told them to wait because
there are massing civilians near our troops, and we cannot keep on withdrawing. They asked us to withdraw yesterday. When I talked to Mr. Enrile, he said, you talk to you, we withdraw a little.
My order is to disperse
We cannot
the crowd.
withdraw all the time, Mr. President. We
Without
must.
shooting them. No, hold on. You disperse the crowd without shooting them.
There was no way for the crowds to know whether Marcos's forces would shoot, but they remained in the streets day and night.
It was the most religious celebration you ever saw. It was priests and nuns everywhere, but not only that, the statues of the Virgin Mary, the rosary everywhere in front of the tanks. It was a religious celebration.
The Catholic radio station became Cory's communications center, calling out supporters, broadcasting news, transmitting messages to dissident officers. Marcos became more and more isolated as entire army units turned against him. It was clear to U.S. officials that Marcos was finished.
Following a meeting that took place in Washington with the president on Sunday, I received first an oral instruction and then one of my few written instructions to tell Marcos that we believed that the time had arrived for a transition and that we were prepared to assist in making that transition as peaceful as possible. Now, he exploded when I gave him that message by phone. And I think, again, it was an example of his refusing to believe something unless he heard it through a channel that he thought really was the president, President Reagan. And that's when, later that night, he called Paul Axel and asked him if it was really true, what I had told him, that we wanted him to leave.
I was given a note indicating that President Marcos was on the phone. So I went into the security office and took the call. He wondered whether or not the message that had been delivered to him by the State Department people yesterday was valid. I indicated that it was.
In Manila, riot police continued to protect Marcos in his palace. He arranged to inaugurate himself as a way of legitimizing his claim to the presidency. His organizers brought a flag-waving crowd into the palace grounds to show that he still had support. That day, Imelda called Nancy Reagan.
My conversation, first of all, was from a first lady to a first lady, a mother to a mother. I called the wife of an ally president, Mrs. Reagan. she, in her human concern, said, "Why don't you come to America?" I said, "I won't go out of the Philippines. I would be the last one to leave my country."
But the Marcoses did leave, and mobs broke into the palace. Flying aboard a U.S. aircraft, the Marcoses and their family crossed the Pacific in stages, en route to exile in Hawaii.
The president had to get some pajamas and the this and the that and all of that. And it was it was a nightmare. When we got to Guam, we were looking for our money. It was nowhere to be seen. And the money that we had was pesos. We were going to send somebody in the bank to exchange it. And then, so we had to go to the PX. The children were crying. It was impossible. We had to buy diapers. We had to buy this. And we had to buy T-shirts. We had to buy simple daily needs of toothpaste or whatever.
After 20 years, the Marcos era was over. Marcos later blamed his collapse on a failure in public relations.
We achieved our goals and established a new society of social justice and achievement, created a people that was no longer indolent, and reactivated the spirit of patriotism. But we did not convince the American and the American press that we had succeeded in doing so. It is going to be my purpose in life to see to it that this is part of history.
The Greeks would say this way, whom the gods would like to destroy, he makes them crazy. And so the snap election was one of those bad decisions of Mr. Marcos. And so it was good that he used the democratic procedures to oust himself.
I, Corazon Cojuangco Aquino, do solemnly swear.
The long agony is over. We are finally free, and we can be truly proud of the unprecedented way we achieved our freedom.
Ninoy believed that only the united strength of a people would suffice to overturn a tyranny so evil and so well organized. It took the brutal murder of Ninoy to bring about that unity in strength in the phenomenon of people power.
7 months later, Cory went to Washington. She appealed for American aid.
Has there been a greater test of national commitment to the ideals you hold dear than that my people have gone through? You have spent many lives and much treasure to bring freedom to many lands that were reluctant to receive it. And here you have a people who want it by themselves and need only the help to preserve it.
I was just so overwhelmed with the kind of reception that I got in the United States during my visit in 1986. I could see that there was still existing a very close relationship between the Philippines and the United States. My husband had said before in an interview in Boston that he felt very sorry for whoever would come after Marcos because he knew of the tremendous problems that Marcos's successor would inherit. Of course, never thinking at the time that his own wife would be the next person after Marcos.
Right here on the #1 pop music station in Metro Manila, and it's reported by WKC.
Marcos had wrecked the economy, leaving a debt of nearly $30 billion to foreign banks. History also confronted Cory with problems she could not begin to solve. Widespread poverty, social injustice, a soaring birth rate. Squatters took over parts of the cities, escaping even worse conditions in the countryside.
We are trying our best that we will go to our president, Madam Aquino, that we have this land, even just a piece, and we will try to rent this, even just a little amount, because we have no land here in the Philippines. That is true. The Lord God knows, sir.
Some regions of the Philippines have not changed in decades. Sugar workers on the island of Negros earn $1 a day. They work only 5 or 6 months a year. Bishop Antonio Fortich has urged reforms.
The greatest issue today, of course, is really the poverty of our people. They cannot improve themselves because they are totally dependent on their masters. And that's created a very miserable situation. For example, when a baby is born to be baptized, they go to their landlords to ask for some money that the child be baptized. Then when they are sick, they go to the landlord, get money for some hospitalization. And then the same thing, when the children are married, they go to the landlord to ask the money for the feast or something like that, and also including funerals. So the whole life of their own laborers hung on the benevolence and the generosity of the landlord.
Ang sabi ng nanay ko, kung bakit kami mahirap, dahil sa kagawa ng Diyos. Kung kami naghihirap. Pero nang malapitan ako ng isang organizer, nang makilala ko siya, doon ko nakita na hindi kagawa ng Diyos kung bakit kami nanging mahirap. Kaya sa nakita ko kung bakit kami nanging mahirap, bangod mismo sang hindi mataas na sweldo na ibinibigay sa amin ng mga planters.
45 million people, 3/4 of the population, live below the poverty line. Many Filipino leaders deplore the gap between rich and poor. One is the governor of Negros, Daniel Lacson.
If you had land, if you were in sugar, when the prices were good, you made a lot of money in sugar. We did not see that while we were making money, some other guy was sacrificing and spending the best years of his life toiling under the sun to make that money for us who belong to the landed class. I firmly believe that a lot of these people didn't really see the problems that were happening at the farm level, because we all got very complacent.
The word feudal society fits the Philippines. It fits the Philippines. There are a few who have the education and they have the money and they possess the land and they possess the buildings, and the great masses of the people work for them in one way or another. I think now we have come to the end of that era, and now there has to be a radical change in society, I think. When the workers began to say, we don't want paternalism, we want justice. We don't want you to be fatherly. You are not our father, you are our brother, and we want to sit at the table with you.
Na kung siya ang magiging presidente ng bansang Pilipinas, unan niya, natatangkilikin at pagbibigyan ay ang mga magsasaka. Kanya kami napunta roon para lamang sariwain namin yung kanyang pinangako sa sambayan ng Pilipino. Yun lang ang inuungkat namin.
Early in 1987, peasants marched into Manila to demand reforms. Troops fired into the crowd, killing 18 and wounding nearly 100. Cory later introduced a land reform program. Critics called it inadequate.
Hindi kami nakikipagdima. Hindi. Ang hinihingi namin katarungan ng manggagawang bukid sa gitnang Pilipinas. Pero bakit bala? Isipin nyo nga, tama bang igasagot sa amin bala at kamatayan ng mga kasama? Na ang hinihingi, hindi kami nakikipagdima. Panghihimagsik sa ating kalagayan ng manggagawang bukid sa gitnang Pilipinas. Isipin nyo nga yan. Bakit ganon? Bakit baril?
If you talked about superficial reforms, then that was something that the ruling classes could live with. But once you talked about basic reforms in society, you were declared as subversive and you were dealt with as such. As the revolutionary movement expands to various parts of the country and gets in direct touch with the people, they accept our thesis that it's only through fundamental change in our society that they can attain that dream of being able to be able to have enough to eat, to be able to have enough to clothe themselves and shelter themselves, to be able to have enough to educate their children.
Army patrols are frequently ambushed by the NPA, the New People's Army, as the communist rebels call themselves. Cory Aquino's attempts to negotiate peace with the communists broke down. The war has continued. It's a war that neither side seems able to win. The rebels misjudged Cory's popularity, and their opposition to her has lost them support. They've also been divided over strategy, some arguing for compromise with the government, others advocating tougher military tactics. The people are caught in the crossfire. Villages are often destroyed by government troops unable to track down the guerrillas.
There was a time when around 3,000 of those poor people had to evacuate, carrying their kitchen utensils, leaving behind the goats, carabaos, and then the pigs that they had, you see, because they were scared and their houses were burnt. Now, when you are confronted with a situation like that, naturally the civilians will not support the soldiers. they contend that the civilians are supporting the MPs. But of course, the civilians have to support the MPs for the simple reason that they cannot be also protected by the regular soldiers.
Cory Aquino had trouble controlling the armed forces. Within her first year and a half as president, military factions staged 5 coups against her. She survived them all. She reorganized the army, raised its pay, and tried to boost its morale on a visit to the military academy, a carbon copy of West Point. In an effort to restore democracy, she drafted a new constitution and held elections. But problems persisted.
I had hoped that peace would be the life of our new democracy, as it had been the moving spirit of its restoration. As I came to power peacefully, so had I hoped to keep it. God knows I have tried. But my offers of peace and reconciliation have been met with the most bloody and insolent rejections by the left and the right. It is clear that the forces of the extremes will not leave us in peace to achieve the recovery and progress we so badly need.
Religion, tradition, continuity, all the signs of stability are there, but they may be deceptive. The Philippines has been described as a social volcano, constantly rumbling, sometimes erupting. Nothing worries America more than a threat to its Philippine bases, Clark Airfield and Subic Naval Base. Like military bases everywhere, they're surrounded by bars and go-go joints. But they serve America's presence in the Pacific and protect the sea lanes to the Middle East. They bring the Philippines $1 billion a year in aid and other expenditures. And they symbolize a continuing relationship between the United States and its former colony.
I was taught, for instance, that the Americans are here as our saviors, that the bases are necessary for my personal protection. We had debates in school, and we would have to focus on why we needed America in the Philippines. They had to protect us from the Russians. They had to protect us from the communists. That it was only because of the Americans that we could become a democratic country, that we needed them for our economy, that without them we were nothing.
Surveys show that most Filipinos favor the bases. But a growing number are protesting, claiming that the bases violate Philippine sovereignty. In many ways, the ferment reflects their quest for national identity, an effort to move forward from their past as an American possession. But the influence of the past is still powerful.
Our great hangover with the United States should have ended a long time ago. The United States is a pervasive presence, not only here but everywhere. And you are dealing with a society that is culturally weak. And how can it defend itself? How can it grow? I think the whole problem that we have with the United States, and it's not just this love-hate relationship, is the fact that we have American ideals, and we cannot sustain these ideals. We are trying to build a society, in the American image.
Neither Americans nor Filipinos can efface history. Their relationship reflects almost a century of shared experience, tensions, tragedies, triumphs. So as Filipinos strive to shape their own image, it's bound to be, at least in part, an American image.